Hi everyone and welcome back to XojoTalk. I am Paul Lefebvre, one of the software engineers here at Xojo. And today, my special guest is John Balestrieri, and he is here with me to talk a bit about Phototape, a new iOS app he made, and a few other things. Welcome, John.
Hey, Paul. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on XojoTalk. It's been a while since we've had our last episode, so it's great to kick things back off with you as our guest. And I say that because John is a particularly notable guest. He is one of the oldest tenured Xojo users. He bought the very first license when Xojo, then Real Basic, first went on sale at Macworld, New York in 1998. Is that right, John? Do you remember that?
That's right. I think I was waiting for Jeff to open up the booth to set up their register payment system so I could quickly hand over my credit card. I was so excited about finally having a product that, allowed me to dabble in development. I had followed Real Basic even before that when it was cross basic under developer release. So I was very excited that, I was at that launch.
Wow, that's pretty cool. Back when there was a Mac World, and when there was actually in New York, those were the days.
I got a physical CD and a printed copy of the book, and it was different times.
Yes, yes, definitely. All right, well, with that little bit of history behind us, let's dive into Phototape, which is an iOS app that John recently made and released, and has been getting a bit of buzz here at Xojo and in a few other places. And it's a neat little app that is made with Xojo and lets you. The term I guess I use would make some sort of interesting photo collages pretty quick and easily. But John, you wrote the thing, so how would you describe Phototape?
Well, it's literally photos and tape, and allows you to connect the two. So I do a lot of photo, journaling with my iPhone, and I have over 200,000 photos on my phone. And sometimes you just need to like collect a bunch of images, like send them to your doctor or send them to like the landscaper. Um, but if you send them, via text messages, they're loose attachments. So I just wanted literally a way to like tape together photos.
Right, yeah, it does show like a little piece of Scotch tape and holding the photos together on the screen when you kind of drag them close enough to each other. They're like auto tape without, all that sticky mess and things.
Right. A little bit of magic.
Yep. So, what gave you the idea for this app? I know you said, sometimes you need stuff like that, but is that the primary impetus for it, or was there other use cases you were?
That's primarily it. So I have been developing photo apps for iOS since around 2010. Phototape is my 13th app for the iOS and macOS platform. Uh, Collage apps have always been a part of the ecosystem of photo apps in the App Store, but there was never the formula for those apps usually involves picking your frame, the number of images you want to include in your collage, and then dropping images into these frames. And I just literally wanted to upend that formula and just take photo A and photo B and tape them together. It really shouldn't be any more difficult than one, two, three steps, and you're done.
Well, I agree. Having played with it a bit, it certainly is pretty darn easy, just a few steps. I need to start making use of this now for my retro computing blog that I often take a bunch of pictures of old computer stuff and getting a bunch in one little photo to stick in between all the writing will be handy. So let's see, what made you decide to make Phototape using Xojo?
Well, this being my 13th app, I did have a lot of prior experience using Xcode and Apple's tools, and I'm well familiar with that development pipeline. But I only started with Apple's tools, around 2010, 2009, coming from a Xojo background, and I really miss the immediacy of just sort of being able to um, code everywhere all at once, or kind of deal with my software at a high level. Since I'm basically doing the entire development from research to final production code, I'm working with a huge sprawling code base. So I really wanted to simplify that process. Um, I just come off of a few very long releases using Xcode and Swift and Objective C and Metal, and it was just too much technically, and I just sort of wanted to take a step back and do something fun development wise.
Well, I love it when people use the word fun and Xojo in the same sentence. That to me is one of its key benefits, and certainly working with some of the large vendor tools can be exhausting at times. So
Very exhausting.
yeah, certainly switching gears to use Xojo sounds like a fun use. So yeah, I've heard you talking about this on the Xojo forum for a period of time, but I don't remember when you first started talking about it. How long would you say you spent working on phototape and getting it all built?
Oh, well, it looks like I started in fall of 2022, but I had to set it aside in order to ship another app in the interim. But I picked it up maybe last November again. So I think we're talking about 9 months from start to finish. If I were to factor in, all the underlying foundational work that I did, the product sort of work and the website and the marketing and all that. So from start to finish, about 9 months, I would say.
Yep, making apps always takes longer than people that don't make apps might guess.
And I'm
So,
very picky, so I end up making things a little bit more difficult for myself than they need to be.
well, the quality there shows in the app. What would you say would be the split between the amount of time you spent like doing development work and the amount you spent on like non-development type stuff, like coming up with the graphics or the icons or the marketing? I know a lot of people ask about that.
I would say it's about, for me, 85% coding and then about 50% marketing and branding and all that sort of thing. And that means like I use a lot of rapid development tools. So, I use Xojo for the software development, but I also use Rapid Weaver for web development. So I can quickly put together a landing page. So I try to use as many high level tools as possible just because I'm working such a broad scope of tasks. I don't want to get bogged down in any particular area.
Right. Well, yeah, a lot of that's key. I mean, when you're a solo person like that, I mean, there's only so many hats you can put on all at once. So you want to
Right.
simplify things and so you can get stuff done. I mean, the idea is to ship things, not to twiddle your thumbs working on boring coding or HTML or Lord knows what that you don't want to spend time on. Let's see here. So, what sort of things did Xojo help make it easier for you when working on phototape?
I think I may have already alluded to this, but I was able to work everywhere all at once. I really get excited about that because, especially in the final shipping stages of a app or a product, I think I'm near the finish line, but then I realized that I never did the about view, right? Or I never did the links, the internal links to, load something from a website, so I need to like jump around multiple areas. It's sort of like a whack-a-mole problem. And Xojo really lets me do that a lot quicker than with Xcode. So if I were doing this project in Xcode, I may have to be really like arms deep in some view controller code, and then I've got to like totally extricate myself mentally from that area of code and focus on an entirely different area, a different subsystem. With Xojo, it's sort of everything sort of even and on the table. And an analogy, a great analogy is uh, and I also get to talk about watches in this analogy. I recently picked up watchmaking as a hobby, and I love the fact that I have this now one desk where I can put everything related to my project out on the table. I've got the movement, I've got the case, I got the dial. It's all there. Nothing's buried, in boxes somewhere. So Xojo is sort of that high level crafts table approach to creating software for me.
That's a great analogy. And at the beginning, it sounded a little bit like you were starting to go down the path of the the last 20% takes 80% of the work thing you tend to hear software engineers say. But uh, yeah, there's always just so many different things to do when building software. Having a way to keep that all in your head more easily is certainly nice. So I'm sure it wasn't all, kittens and butterflies and fun things. You must have had some challenges working and creating photo tape. What were some interesting ones you'd like to share?
Well, before fully committing to the project, so I at first I sort of took a staged approach because I had used Xojo for the past 2 or 3 years to create tools, production tools for my apps. So I wrote color analysis tools and some other things that ended up creating data that ended up in my shipping Xcode apps. So I was very curious at that point whether or not Xojo could um, take take an idea and turn that into a shipping iOS app. So I took a tiered approach to roll out. So you know my I think my biggest challenge along this way was like, so first I want to say that, Xojo cleared all the gates because, obviously I have a shipping app in the App Store and there weren't any like, hurdles that couldn't be overcome. Uh, I think the hardest thing was adapting to some of the newer um, APIs that Apple put in place. So while Xojo had built-in functionality for um, importing images, it was just a single image. And my particular use case for this photo app meant that you had to choose 4 or 5 images or up to 10 images at a time. And in that case, Christian and his MBS plugins, just kind of filled the gap right there. But that was sort of the main thing where I kind of like held my breath. And for a couple of days, I wrestled with a few different implementations with declares and, looking down the road of, developing a plugin myself. But I ended up, having a drop-in solution for this stuff was in the end what I ended up doing. And having implemented this stuff from scratch using Apple's APIs on the Objective-C side, I can tell you it's not something I want to maintain, right? You've got to do a lot of boilerplate code just to get some basic, walking in the door functionality. But I was able to get that with Christian. So in a way, that was the biggest area with that I was worried about. But solution found.
Cool. Yeah. Well, and shout out to Christian's plugins, which do help add things that aren't necessarily built into Xojo. I'm a big fan of external libraries, and hopefully in the future, Xojo will be making it much easier to have lots of different external libraries you can incorporate. Because every tool has libraries you pull in at some point. Just some tools make it a little easier to find and pull libraries in than Xojo does at times. So. Not everything can have everything, but having a collection of things to pull from, always super handy. I think it again.
And it's always more than one way to, achieve the goal. So
Right.
it's always good to have lots of options at your disposal. You've got declares, you've got plugins, you've got, just rethinking the problem. There's a lot of different, that's what one thing that has always appealed to me with Xojo. So prior to creating these iOS apps, I worked in a newsroom, which meant I was a newsroom developer and I was working under deadline. And Xojo was my tool of choice at the Associated Press because I knew when I had to, I was given data from a satellite that was in a particular format. They needed to see images from it, or we had election results, so we needed to turn from XML into a map. Like I always knew I had like 4 or 5 different ways to solve the problem. And it's a great tool to have because it gives you a lot of options.
Yeah, that's a great point to bring up. I tend to focus on that too when we're doing stuff, internally on our end. I always try to come up with more than one way to solve the particular thing. Because, when you're first starting out, any idea might sound like the best idea ever, but you don't know until you plow through it that it's going to get you to the end. And it could, 3/4 of the way through, just be like, boom, roadblocks. This isn't going to work. And if you don't have these backups essentially in your back pocket, you're going to be pretty panicked. So yeah, having that's just a general not a philosophy for coding that I think makes sense for everybody. So not necessarily anything particular to Xojo, but it's always good to consider lots of options. And that's one of the things that I think, those of us that write software, it's the thing that makes it fun for us because there are those so many little things we can investigate and try to figure out. Uh, Now, of course, we're going to put in the show notes for this podcast links to photo tape, so you can buy it from the App Store. It's just a few bucks, and I highly recommend it. It's a fun little special purpose app that certainly deserves a place on your iPhone. But John, were there any other Xojo related things that you might want to bring up? I know you had told me before we started recording that you had a few things that you used in the making of Xojo tape, but so what is some of that stuff?
So Phototape is built on a very graphical foundation. You can touch photos and drag them around, and the camera kind of pans and moves depending on what you're touching. And in order to build that, there were plenty of drop-in solutions. Like I could have used, Christian's wrappers for Apple Scene Kit, but I ended up writing my own 2D animation framework to facilitate all of the drawing, the dynamic drawing, the scene graph drawing, and all of the touch and drag interactions. And that is available as an open source set of code. I don't have to link off my head. It's probably on my GitHub, and it's certainly something I posted about in the forum. But pretty much, the entire graphical foundations of Phototape are available as this, very Xojo friendly API framework set of code that anyone can use for their own projects. Right now, it's a little bit bound to the Mac, but with a few new pieces of code, it's going to be totally, completely cross-platform.
Ah, cool. Well, I'll definitely dig up the link and get that in the show notes as well. And you said that works on the Mac and iOS, I presume, since that's what Phototape is. And
Exactly.
but
And the only thing that is bound to that platform is it's based on the graphics API, but I am using calls to core graphics matrix transforms. I don't have to. I'm just not a math guy, so I didn't feel confident enough re-implementing some very basic matrix functions.
well, who doesn't like to implement matrix functions on a weekend or something? That's always interesting. All right, so well, let's transition a little bit. We're recording this podcast the week before WWDC, which is happening this month. And so maybe we can briefly just touch base on a little bit about our guesses, maybe. What sort of thing at WWDC are you expecting from Apple, or that you hope Apple talks about, or that maybe you hope they don't talk about? I don't know, but
Wow. So I have a little bit of history with WWDC. I went back, in the early 2000s was my first one. So I sort of have grown a little jaded with the annual trotting out of the latest and greatest. I'm always very excited. Don't get me wrong. And I know, I don't want to say anything that will get me in trouble, because I know like people are going to listen to this and someone's going to be at Apple and I'm going to be blacklisted or something. But like I historically, being a very small developer, I have to be very careful about the things I choose to work on. So I have noticed a trend in the past, and I will get to your question in a moment, where Apple offers 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 100 new APIs that offer fantastic, beautiful functionality, and then between June and the release in the fall, there is sort of a gold rush where everyone's grabbing their shovels and they're heading out and they're building apps around these new APIs and trying to get a foothold in a very competitive market. So I've been in the App Store as an indie since 2009. I That's one of my principal foundations. I try to avoid competition at all costs. So even though Apple's going to offer a lot of great new stuff out there, I would feel it would be unwise for me to get very excited about it and immediately start capitalizing on it, because I'm going to be competing with companies that are much larger and faster and smarter than I am, trying to bring something to market. So that said, I am looking forward to more perhaps marketing tools for smaller developers. Apple started a small business or a small developer program 2 years ago. I'm part of that, so I enjoy reduced fees
Right.
uh, for the App Store. I'm hoping perhaps Apple offers more for small developers in the marketing arena. So the way I see Apple evolving and the App Store evolving over the past few years is it's sort of become more of a, as larger companies get involved, it's the App Store seems to be on rotation for Amazon or Taylor Swift or HBO or the latest Marvel blockbuster, and those are great, fantastic, engaging experiences. But I'm always looking for ways to like stay visible in such a competitive market. So I'm hoping, um, just as Apple's small business developer program um, gave a little relief in that area, they will offer some more business opportunities for smaller developers.
Right, yeah, a bit more indie focus. Yeah, I can see what you're saying because I did kick off that small developer program a few years ago, but it kind of just, from outside observation, seems to have just stayed the same since then, with no changes or anything like that. And it does appear, the time I mostly go to the App Store these days to like update the apps I already have more than anything, but it seems
Yep.
like a lot of the ones you see on the little, grabs, the homepage that's showing you all the new stuff is like you said, it's big name stuff from big publishers. It's not a great way for smaller folks to get their stuff out in front of eyeballs. And
And that's Apple's program. I'm not complaining. Like I'm very grateful for Apple. I've had spotlights in the past, and it's wonderful. But at the end of the day, I just want to do fun stuff with you know computers um, on the Apple and Mac and iOS platforms, and I just want to keep doing that for as long as possible.
yeah, yeah. Well, it just, for someone, like the both of us, I suppose, that have been on these for platforms for such a long time, you remember those early days when everything was new and everything was made by, small developers at the time because the big people haven't jumped into it yet because they move more slowly. And and some of us look back and, oh, we miss those days where you could easily find some cool little thing and so, yeah, it would be interesting to see if Apple is able to do anything around that. Not that this is like an easy thing to solve or anything like that, but it's just interesting. Um, yeah, I know that everyone's expecting them to probably have some sort of big announcement that they tie to AI in some way or another. It'll be interesting to see what Apple does there because you wouldn't expect them to just go the same route as everyone else, where there'd just be some sort of chatbot, the Apple AI
Right.
chatbot. You wouldn't expect them to do that. Uh,
I'm
but
hoping whatever they roll out in that area is thoughtful and considered, just like everything else that they roll out is. Like I'm glad they're not the first in many technologies, but when they decide to move on a technology, it is thoughtful and considered, and it is measured the rollout, and I always appreciate that.
yeah, just something that is useful rather than almost a cool tech demo. You want to see from Apple the useful way to make use of this newfound tech rather than just say, "Hey, look, shiny new tech. Let's play with it."
Exactly.
Personally, I remain a little bit puzzled by the new iPads they announced that have the M4 chips in them, yet none of the Macs do. So it'd be interesting to see if they say anything about that at WWDC regarding hardware and particularly Mac hardware, which is usually, of all the Apple hardware, the one that I tend to pay most attention to.
I think they're able to now to move so quickly with these end chips that it may be nothing to them to just come out with another revision, because the next one's going to leapfrog it, you know, months later. They don't have to have a life cycle of yearly anymore. They own the whole production, pipeline.
Yeah, it'll just be. I'm just interested to see what they would do there because they already put out the MacBook Airs with the M3s in them, so they're not necessarily ripe for getting the M4s, and maybe they won't ever. And then, but the bigger, more powerful Pro models are now I guess, at least a year in place using older M level chips. So then the question is are these going to get something like an M4 Pro, and is that ready all so quickly? It seems to me there's just some interesting stuff there that, in the past it was maybe a little easier to kind of track where Apple was going with this, but now it seems like, oh, it's going to be a surprise. They might not even say anything. That'll probably be a surprise too.
Well, everyone was sort of blindsided by the whole switch to silicon, and the drop. Well, I mean, maybe the Intel was getting a little long on the tooth, so you knew something had to give there. But again, like they are probably working on something that will upend the table and you know rewrite the whole story at some point. But I'm very, very pleased with the whole silicon transition. I have an M, you mentioned you have an M2 Mac there. I have like an M1 Pro. I'm so pleased, that I made the investment in this machine. Everything runs great on it. Xojo runs great on it. Thanks, by the way, for the recent performance updates to Xojo earlier this year. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, the performance updates were great, and a lot of them came from feedback from users that discovered things that maybe could be optimized and sent us little notes and tidbits, and then we dug into them a little bit, and they're like, "Hey, that could be tweaked." So yeah, it's always great when your software runs faster and more efficiently than before. So that's always something to strive towards, I suppose, even if all the computers keep getting faster and sometimes makes some of that effort seem not worth it. But it's a nice feeling when things just are snappy and zippy. All right, well, we'll see what happens next week at WWDC. The keynote will be kicking it off, and I usually try to pay attention to the keynote. I probably don't pay too much attention to the stuff that happens after the fact. I kind of wait and see what falls. I know directly for us, there's always a new version of iOS that's announced with new features. So we usually got to pay a bit of attention to that to see, if there's any bombshells that affect our frameworks that we need to, get in the schedule sooner rather than later. So that's sort of a pay attention point that we have to eyeball, but usually they're just adding, crazy new weird stuff, and it doesn't really break the fundamentals. So as long as they don't announce some new silicon squared CPU that they're putting out. All right. Well, thank you, John, so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Paul.
And for making a photo tape and talking about that. And I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of XojoTalk. Hopefully we'll have a few more coming up in a shorter time frame. So do be sure to subscribe or like or whatever you're supposed to do with these things. And thanks everyone for listening. Have a great day.